Hi, you're listening to Stephan Livera podcast, a show about Bitcoin and Austrian economics brought to you by swan.com. Have you wondered about MuSig2 and Taproot use in practice? Are you also thinking about some of the soft fork upgrades that are being discussed and proposed for Bitcoin, such as APO, ANYPREVOUT, and Check Template Verify, CTV? Well, today I'm speaking with Brandon Black, who joins me to talk about his experience with implementing MuSig2 in practice, as well as some of his thoughts on APO, CTV, and his particular proposal, which hopefully will help educate the community on what the options are, and perhaps that informs the pathway forward. So for this episode, we do get into some of the more advanced details around Bitcoin scripting and some of the trade-offs and what are some of the ins and outs, but I also think this is useful information. And for those of you interested in the soft fork conversation, just skip forward to about halfway through this episode. Anyway, now on to my chat with Brandon. Brandon, welcome to the show.
Great. Thanks to be here. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so Brandon, I saw a couple of things. You were recently writing about your experience implementing MuSig2 at BitGo, and of course, your proposal in relation to a kind of combination of APO and CTV. So, let's hear first a little bit about you. I know it sounds like you've been working in Bitcoin development for a while.
Yeah, thanks. I've been working in Bitcoin. I think I joined Casa at the end of 2017. That was my first Bitcoin job. Kind of been watching the space since long before that, and it was great to finally get into it full time. I've basically been working on Bitcoin wallets the whole time. I did some work at Casa on their wallet in the early days there, and then spent some time trying to do a Bitcoin hardware device startup that didn't end up panning out, and then spent a couple of years at BitGo.
Fantastic. And so, so let's get into the experience around MuSig2 and a little bit of what happened with Taproot. So as I understand, at the time of Taproot activation, it was, obviously it was a bit earlier. What was the experience at that time, and how were you assessing it at that point?
Yeah, it was a really cool experience. Even from when I first got into Bitcoin development, I wanted to bring MuSig2 to a production wallet. So I joined Casa, I guess it was about 2 years before, or 3 years even, before Taproot activation. And I was like, a new Bitcoin developer, super excited. I wanted to do Taproot yesterday. Of course, it was still years before Taproot would even activate. So it was awesome when I got the opportunity to join BitGo, and the first thing we did there was start building the Taproot wallet at BitGo. We were able to launch that concurrent with the Taproot activation on mainnet, but we had hoped to make that a MuSig2 wallet from the get-go. And of course, as I went researching the status of the MuSig2 code and the MuSig2 specification, reading through the paper, the spec, talking to Jonas Nick a little bit, realized that it just was not production ready yet. So we launched without MuSig2. While we waited for the spec to be finalized.
And there were multiple iterations there. So as I recall, there was MuSig, like just MuSig1, let's say, and then MuSigDN, and then later MuSig2. So I guess you were still sort of waiting for things to shake out a little bit there, right?
Yeah, by the time we started coding for Taproot, it was pretty clear that MuSig2 was going to be the most likely path forward. We did evaluate the other options. At BitGo, they're working on, or they've deployed, I think, an ECDSA TSS implementation. So BitGo is not afraid of doing the kind of more complicated protocols that MuSigDN basically is somewhat similar to those other. And
when you said ECDSA TSS, that's threshold signature scheme?
Yes, correct.
Gotcha. Yeah, so that's, pre-Schnorr, you were already looking at advanced, versions of doing this, right?
Right. And BitGo has to do that because they support many coins, and not all coins have Schnorr signatures, so they need to have a broad range of cryptographic primitives to do their offering on all the chains they offer.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we were looking at the different options, but it was pretty clear that MuSig2 would be the right option, even though it wasn't fully specified when we started on Taproot.
Great. And I guess just for people who aren't familiar, what's your actual role with BitGo?
Well, truth be told, I left BitGo about a little under a month ago now. I was the manager of the Bitcoin team. I started as an engineer and then ended up picking up the management of the team, which was a great experience. BitGo is an awesome company to work for, and I have great respect for them, but I have moved on about a month ago. Okay,
gotcha. Okay, great. Well, so let's talk a little bit about the different schemes that were available and why MuSig2, and I guess also there's also that conversation around Frost. So do you want to just explain for us, why MuSig2 and, how you were thinking about, Frost as well at that point?
Yeah. The shortest answer to that is that MuSig2 is beautifully simple. I talked to Jonas Nick about it, I think at Bitcoin Miami 22. And we were talking about this parallel in the MuSig2 construction in the way the keys are aggregated and also in the way the nonces are produced. In both cases, you're kind of protecting against a rogue key or a rogue nonce attack, and the protections are similar. And the result is a protocol that's very easy to reason about and very short to implement. As I mentioned in that OpCheck field report I wrote, the reference implementation is only 461 lines of Python. I've implemented it twice, once in C and once in JavaScript. And in both cases, it's pretty easy to get it correct and to match the spec and then to have it be auditable against the spec. So that's really the main reason to use MuSig2 over a lot of the other options. Then we have to kind of get into when can you not use MuSig2? BitGo, in this case, is in a really good position to use MuSig2 because the way the BitGo wallet is constructed, the three keys are described as the BitGo key, the user key, and the backup key. And the vast majority, probably over 99% of all signings happen on the BitGo key and the user key. Moreover, in the BitGo wallet construction, when a transaction is initially created, we know which two keys will be signing at transaction creation time. So that makes it easy for us to use MuSig2, which is a N of N multi-sig protocol, because we know which are the most likely keys, so we can put those in the MuSig2, and we know which ones are going to sign from the construction of the transaction. I talked to Jameson Lopp at Casa about Casa's situation, whether they could use MuSig2, and in their case, when they start assigning, they don't have a clear answer as to exactly which keys are going to sign out of a wallet. And so for them, they'd have to start more than one separate MuSig session to try and figure out which keys are eventually going to sign and collect multiple signatures from each signer. It really complicates the process for some wallets, where the BitGo wallet was kind of perfectly positioned to use MuSig2. Where let's say Casa might need to use Frost or might need to use on-chain multisig because they don't have the same clear answers to those questions when they start signing.
I see, because we're talking about the different combinations, right? We're talking about how many keys there are and which combinations would be signing in that scenario. So just so I'm clear then, are we talking, so you mentioned the BitGo key, the user key, and a backup key, and one part I'm maybe a little bit unclear on is my understanding it's an N of N setup. So does that mean all three keys have to sign? And I'm confused then about the backup key, or is it actually more like a 2 of 2 setup of any of those three?
Yeah, great question. If you think about on-chain multisig, if you have a 2 of 3 on-chain multisig, that means any 2 of those 3 keys can sign. You can construct that in a small multisig. It's easy. You can say, if I have a 2 of 3 multisig, there are 3 pairs of 2 keys which could sign this transaction. And because of the beauty, the wonder of TapScript and Taproot, you can say, you could do it with, as we did in the original BitGo implementation, 3 separate 2 of 2 paths. And that gets the same exact security function as a 2 of 3 on-chain multisig. Then if we use MuSig, we put the most common signing 2 of 2 as the key path and the less common 2 of 2s as script paths, and get the same security behavior as a 2 of 3 on-chain multisig, but without having to display all 3 keys on-chain.
I see, yeah. And so this is relying on that idea of key paths and script paths spending. And so the key path spend is the one that's the most arguably, that's the one you want to do most of the time. And then if you need to use those other pathways, that's where you actually are showing the script that you want to sign against, right? Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And with BitGo, again, since it's 2 of 3, you always know exactly which 2 keys have signed, right? If you sign the key path, you know exactly it's the BitGo and user key. If you sign one of one of the script paths, you know exactly which 2 keys signed, and the other script path, you know exactly which 2 keys. There's no ambiguity in the BitGo construction. Obviously, with more complex constructions, you could have ambiguity in what's actually available in the script path.
And it is interesting as well that there's more talk now about the actual use of Taproot, because I think that was a line that maybe sometimes shitcoiners or maybe detractors of Bitcoin will sometimes come out and say, oh, look, see, you're not even using Taproot yet. And yet, here we are, MuSig2 is, it's being used. And even with LND, they've just put out Taproot channels in LND. So it seems like it takes some time for the development work, but it is happening in fairness.
Absolutely. But one of my biggest lessons in my years as a Bitcoin developer has been patience. Like I said, I wanted to do Taproot from 2017, and of course you can't. You have to be patient. I wanted to do MuSig when we started working on Taproot in 2020. You have to be patient. It's just the way of these things. So, people are like, oh, you're not using Taproot. It's like, because we're working on it. We're all of us throughout the ecosystem are working on developing the code and getting it audited, making sure that we've got things close enough to write. We're not going to be perfect, but we kind of have to find this balance of spending enough time vetting it to get it right.
Got it. Okay. And so while we're here, do you mind spelling out some of the benefits? Like, what are the benefits that you see for a developer or for a Bitcoin business to use MuSig2?
So the single biggest benefit is a reduction in on-chain fees. If I recall correctly, it's 43.5% cheaper to use a Taproot key path than a native SegWit 2 of 3 script. So this lets you use a multi-sig construction like the BitGo wallet with no additional on-chain cost relative to a plain pay-to-witness pub key hash address. I mean, there's a slight cost, but it's marginal as opposed to being a significant cost to use multi-sig before Taproot and MuSig. There's also somewhat of a privacy benefit, especially in a case like the BitGo wallet, where on the BitGo wallet, again, 99+% of all signings happen on that key path. And as far as the Bitcoin blockchain is concerned, those key path spends look exactly like any single sig wallet. Traditionally, everyone could identify transactions from the BitGo wallet because BitGo was most of the 2 of 3 traffic on the network. But now that BitGo traffic can start shifting over to something that looks just like a 1 of 1.
I see. And so hopefully, the goal in this case is if lots of people are all using Taproot, and it looks like Taproot single signature spends, everyone looks the same. And so there's a bit more of an anonymity set to hide in that particular perspective. Now, to be clear, there may still be other methods of tracking, for example, the transaction graph, but at least from the script type heuristic, it's looking the same, correct?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the common input heuristic is obviously still out there. Although hopefully as Dan Gold and others work on PayJoin stuff, we'll start to break that common input heuristic as well and gain some on-chain privacy.
Summarizing the key benefits, as you said in your blog post for Bitcoin Optech, it looks like a native SegWit input is 104.5 VBytes, and a MuSig key path input is 57.5 VBytes. So yeah, like you said, it's like about 40% saving. And so just to put that in context as well, because I guess it depends how often you are spending out of that wallet, right? So if if we're thinking about a user who just does a transaction once a year, they might be like, who cares? Like, it's 40 bytes. But in the case of production grade, large wallets, that would be a meaningful saving because, if you're BitGo and you're being, let's say, a custodian for people, or maybe you are the custodian for exchanges and brokers out there, they may be doing a lot of transactions. So 40% is actually a meaningful saving in that case. Have I got it right there?
Yeah, you've got it exactly right. The one of BitGo's main customer groups is exchanges that BitGo co-signs for. And those customers do tons and tons and tons of transactions. And they also just have a lot of small UTXOs. They get small deposits from users trading on their platform, and they need to consolidate those. And those consolidation fees can eat significantly into their revenues. So it really does matter to them that we get these fees down. And of course, it also makes Bitcoin more efficient. We can get more transactions into blocks this way, which some people think is a bad thing, but that's a separate topic.
Yeah. Okay. And so the main benefit being small size transactions, and the point is it's not trivial. Like, it actually is quite a meaningful saving. And so can you tell us a little bit of your views on the choice of scripts that you went with there?
Yeah, we talked a bit about this with the comparison between BitGo and Casa in using MuSig2. There's a huge design space in Taproot scripts, and it's non-trivial, let's say, to pick which scripts. Like for the BitGo case, with this MuSig2 address type, we could have used 2 of 2 MuSig key path, and then a single script path with a op checksig add style multisig in the tap script. We could have done what we ended up doing with 2 of 2, just plain op checksig script paths. Or we could have put all 3 2 of 2 options also in the script in case there's a break in MuSig2 and we're not able to sign with that key path anymore. So you really have to consider in picking scripts to use with TapScript what your specific wallet's needs are and what types of wallets you're going to be using this with. If I was designing a wallet for hard cold storage, I would have used a different style of script than I was designing a wallet for BitGo to use with a production exchange wrap hot wallet. And maybe even the same exchange customer of BitGo might use different address type. They might use the previous 3-script style Taproot address for their cold wallet, but their hot wallet, they might use the MuSig2 and 2 scripts address type. So there's just a lot of design space there in the TapScript world. And unlike with kind of the previous SegWit or legacy addresses on Bitcoin, it's hard to come up with a set of obvious best practices. Each wallet designer in the Taproot world has to evaluate their own specific needs before they can pick what scripts to use.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess the key elements there are how much of your script you're exposing, what is the size of the script. These are the considerations that come into it, right?
Yeah, the size of the script you're exposing, and then how much fallback you need. Like how much money are you risking? Let's say if there's a break in MuSig2 and we can't sign with MuSig2, how costly is it going to be to use those backup key paths? And is that an acceptable trade-off that we can't sign with that most common or that easiest or that cheapest signature type? So yeah, there's that. And then there's also, as you said, yeah, exposing the keys. Yeah, you said that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. And so now some listeners, people who are following Bitcoin Twitter may have seen some of the drama, the big fight, the beef between Rob Hamilton and Rindale on MPC Gang versus the Script Boys. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the that great debate that's happening, the MPC Gang versus Script Gang.
Oh, it's so good. It's so much fun. I think the humor they put into it, they're both great, X posters, whatever we call it these days. And I've really just enjoyed the points that they make, because what they've ended up doing is in a humorous way, exposing a lot of the trade-offs, the benefits, the downsides of each of these things. We see that MPC protocols, really with the exception of MuSig2, tend to get expensive and a little bit harder to reason about. And we see that, scripts are large on chain but we see that, scripts are expressive and they can show what you're doing. So it's just great. It's wonderful fun.
Yeah. Okay. So then I guess, in terms of what you've been doing, you would put MuSig2 in let's say a slightly different category to the more complex style MPC like Frost. And then even then there's another big jump from there to what we're seeing, as I'm sure you would have seen. I think there was a recent exploit or something. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there was an exploit at Fireblocks with the MPC, but it was not related to. It was not like a MuSig2 or a Frost MPC, right?
Yeah, exactly right. There's MuSig2, there's Frost, and then there's other MPC, and they are each different. So to kind of compare them. The Frost signing protocol is round optimized. It's pretty minimal, similar to MuSig2. The cryptography is a bit more complex, but it doesn't have major online requirements where there's, many rounds going back and forth in it. But the distributed key generation in Frost is still pretty involved. And then MuSig2, both the key generation and the signing can be done pretty easily offline. Anyone who has the public keys can make a MuSig aggregate key without talking to the other owners. And that's a beautiful thing about MuSig.
Right. It's like a non-interactive setup.
And then there's, on the far side of that, there's the ECDSA TSS, wherein both the key generation and the signing require this significant online interaction with a lot of commitments going back and forth to protect the protocol as it's being operated, which opens up potential, not necessarily actual, but potential vulnerability space.
Okay, yeah, interesting. And so just to make sure everyone's following along there, do you mind just sort of spelling out at a high level, like MPC versus script, like what are they, just to make sure everyone can follow along?
Yeah. So in general, MPC is a broad category of ways for multiple people to collaborate on creating a single cryptographic result that'll be seen on chain, typically a digital signature. And so this, MuSig2 falls into that category, as does Frost, as does ECDSA, TSS. They're all ways for a group of people to collaborate creating a single signature. And then Script, of course, is Bitcoin Script, where the execution path for spending some Bitcoin is visible on chain, and there's some satisfaction that's provided that usually contains a digital signature, but may also contain other information like what path to take through that path on the script.
Back to the show in a moment. The lead sponsor of Stephan Livera podcast is Swan.com, and Swan is organizing a festival for Bitcoin. Pacific Bitcoin Festival is coming October 5th and 6th in LA, California. This is going to be an amazing experience with so many awesome speakers, ranging from people like Max Kaiser and Stacey Herbert, VJ Boyapati, Preston Pish, Greg Foss, Corey Clipston, Lynn Alden, Jimmy Song, and so many more. There's going to be a main stage for dedicated talks, panels, and fireside chats, and this is all going to be Bitcoin-only stuff, by the way. There will also be a Swan Dome, where there will be deep dive sessions, as well as other events and things going on through that week. So make sure you book your tickets and check your calendar days and all of that. And of course, there is a VIP ticket where those VIPs will get preferred seating and viewing areas for the main stage. They'll have a private lounge for networking and connection. There'll be an open bar for access by the VIPs, as well as complimentary lunch. So check out the tickets over at pacificbitcoin.com. Use code Livera for a discount there. Mempool.space is the leading Bitcoin and blockchain visualizer out there. I use it all the time when I'm about to send a Bitcoin transaction because it helps me target my fee, whether I'm looking for a low, medium, or high priority transaction fee. It's just a really handy way to target the fee and set it appropriately. Mempool.space allows you to view Bitcoin transactions. You can view Bitcoin blocks. You can scroll the mempool blocks. They have a range of other features that relate to things like the Lightning Network. And Mempool.space is free and open source software, so you can run it yourself. So keep an eye out for some upcoming features. The team is always working on new features. I'm looking forward to the Mempool Accelerator program, which is coming soon. Go and check it all out at mempool.space. Back to the show. Okay, yeah, gotcha. And so where, let's say, team, Miniscript or Miniscript gang or whatever they're calling themselves, Rob and his gang, I guess what they're getting at with the idea of Miniscript is this idea that you can have more complicated pathways, and it's easier for people to collaborate and reason about those complicated pathways and have like some kind of, back out pathway 5 years from now or 10 years from now as like a get out of jail free or, as a I forgot my password sort of setup. But the downside, as you're mentioning, is it shows more on-chain, literally. It's showing on-chain what are the public keys, and it's a bigger cost in terms of transaction size, but you get some benefits there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing to point out is that I'm a huge fan of Taproot, and Taproot helps to limit the downsides of script, because if you use Taproot, you can have each of your separate script paths that would otherwise all show up on chain hidden except for the one that you choose. So let's say you have some secret backup path that is just a single sig that you gave to your mother. Unless you tell people about that, you can be using your Taproot wallet with let's say a really secure 3 of 5 all the time, and no one will ever know that secret single sig is there unless you tell them. And that's really a beautiful thing about Taproot is that when you design a Taproot wallet, you can have many different paths that let you have a recoverable wallet and still use it in a secure way day to day, a more secure way, let's say. And the great thing about MPC versus script is that you can combine these things as we did at BitGo, right? We've got a MPC-based key path and then scripts as backups. And that's really, I think, what the future of Bitcoin on Taproot is going to look like. Wallets will have, whether it be a MuSig or a Frost key path, and then some complex set of recoverable scripts down below that, so that the wallet gets really the best of both worlds.
I see. Yeah, that's a great explanation. I think it helped me understand a little bit better as well. So, would you say, that explanation you just gave, would you say that's applicable for large custodian companies like BitGo, but not as relevant for everyday plebs or small businesses? Or do you see that as like maybe 5-10 years down the line, most people will use some kind of setup like that where they have MPC for the key path and some kind of Miniscript enabled technology for their script path spending?
It's hard to predict the future, of course. I think those who use on-chain, which over time on Bitcoin will trend towards being somewhat bigger holders, will end up using some kind of MPC key path plus script recovery paths. It's what many people are kind of working towards. If you look at the I've lost the name of it. The wallet that the Wizard Sardine folks are working on.
Liana. Yeah.
Yeah, Liana. Yeah, they're going in that direction. You look at BitGo is, it's kind of heading in that direction. Everyone is really looking in that direction of MPC plus script as the way to hold Bitcoin. And even the op vault proposal that's out there from
James
O'Byrne, yeah. That also is looking in that same direction, where there's probably going to be a key path that might be all of the keys involved, but then there's also this vault structure hidden under there. So yeah, I think that's really where holders of on-chain Bitcoin are going to go, would be my suspicion.
Right. And then when you think about Lightning, of course, it makes sense for them to use more of an MPC pathway for most of their, for example, Lightning doing Taproot channels, right? Like that would make more sense for them too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at Lightning or other kind of proposed layer 2 type solutions, they're all going to have some kind of MPC involved to keep their on-chain footprint as small as possible. And again, to maintain the privacy, as we already talked about for using Taproot key path, you kind of blend in as long as you don't have to use the backup paths.
Okay. So when it comes to using MuSig2 down to brass tacks in terms of the nonce generation, so one part that you spell out in your article is around nonce generation and having to be more careful around that, as well as the multiple rounds of interaction required with the hardware security module. So can you just explain a little bit of that and elaborate on that process for us?
Yeah. Unlike script multisig, where the signing, each party can just sign and then share their signature, with MuSig2, the parties do have to collaborate to make the signature. And as a result, if you're using some kind of hard to access key, you're going to have to make 2 trips to it in the typical case. The specification allows for nonces to be pre-generated to kind of elide that extra trip to the key, but it's difficult to do that correctly because nonce storage is a big challenge for MuSig implementations. So in general, the high level thing to mention here is that a reuse of a secret nonce in any of these signing protocols, ECDSA, Schnorr, MuSig, etc., reusing the nonce, the secret nonce, leaks your secret key. Like, this is a fact. Jonas, showed me the math on it at one point. I was like, oh yeah, it really is just that simple. You basically do some subtraction and you get the secret key if the nonce is reused. So in single signature protocols, this is easy to solve. You use a deterministic nonce that depends on the message being signed and the secret key and a few other bits of data, and that nonce will never be reused in a way that would leak the secret key. The key thing here is that the nonce must never be reused and generate a different signature. The resulting signature bytes must be identical if the same nonce is used. And that is true with deterministic nonces in ECDSA single sig or Schnorr single sig or basically anything. With these multi-signature protocols, now you have to have multiple parties collaborating to produce the nonce, and so they can't use a single deterministic nonce because the other party could then make their nonce change and get a different signature from the party that used the deterministic nonce. In the MuSig spec, they did make one carve-out for that, which is the last party to produce nonces and to sign can use a deterministic nonce. And why is that? Because they have all of the data that's going to go into the signature, and so they can be absolutely certain they will only use the same nonce if the exact same signature bytes will be produced, because they've already got the nonces from the other parties. So this is all kind of hard to reason about, which gets to the point of nonces are difficult, and they are especially difficult in multi-signature protocols. So signers that can't use a deterministic nonce have to be extremely careful that when they generate a secret nonce, they have to hold on to it until the second round of the protocol. And then as soon as they get the second round, they have to make sure they get rid of that secret nonce because it becomes toxic. If they were to use it again, it would leak their secret key. And that's kind of the summary of nonces and how multi-signatures make them more difficult to get right.
Right, I see. And so I'm, from conversations I've been looking at in terms of Frost, there were conversations about pre-computing some of these and having them stored with the different hardware wallets and hardware devices and things like this. Did you look at anything like that, or is it more, in the case of this setup, it's more like you're just doing it per transaction.
Yeah, for the BitGo solution, we use the deterministic nonce generation on the hardware security module, because the hardware security module is coded to sign second in each of the ways it's used. And then the client key, the user key, signs with the random nonce, and it is per transaction generated, signs, thrown away. I should say generated, read from storage, thrown away, and then signs. We're very careful to make sure that nonce is thrown away as soon as possible to avoid reuse.
I see. Yeah. So there's lots of bits and pieces to do it correctly, but at the same time there are benefits, as you said, and so let's see if more and more custodians and more Bitcoin users start to use this.
Yeah, I'm optimistic. I think it's a really great protocol for Bitcoin. It kind of keeps the Bitcoin ethos of keeping it simple, keeping it easy to reason about, etc.
Okay, great. So let's get into this proposal that you've put up, which relates to some of the soft fork discussion around check template verify, ANYPREVOUT, and TX hash and check sig from stack. So do you want to just give us a bit of an overview? Like, why did you do this combination proposal?
Why did I do this? That's a great question. In many ways, it comes down to education. I've noticed in talking with many folks about check template verify and about ANYPREVOUT that there is kind of a lack of clear understanding in the community about these proposals, I should say. And kind of to a comical degree, the folks who really want CTV don't understand APO, and the folks who really want APO don't understand CTV, and many folks understand neither. And so part of what I wrote this proposal for is to show there's a lot of common ground in these proposals. They do a lot of the same. They offer a lot of the same things. They're looking at it from different angles, but there's not actually that different. And so by putting them in one proposal, making a table of the differences, I'm hoping to kind of move the conversation forward on what we think the right types of, call it template hashes, we want to allow in this, hopefully, next soft fork for Bitcoin. I think that this is the right direction to be going, allowing kind of commitments that don't fully commit to what's being spent, but commit to how it's being spent, which is basically what both ANYPREVOUT and check template verify allow, is the right direction for Bitcoin to go. And then it comes down to the details of exactly in which way we do that.
Okay. So for listeners who maybe aren't familiar, maybe it would be great to hear from your perspective. If you could just talk through, like, from your perspective, what's CTV and what's your, from your perspective, what's APO, and then we can sort of go into your proposal.
Sure. So CTV or check template verify tries to maximally constrain a spending Bitcoin transaction without constraining what input is being spent into that transaction. And the reason it does that is essentially to avoid infinite hash loop, where you have to know the hash of the input in order to know the hash of the check template verify, and then you need to know, and you loop all forever to get the correct hash. And so check template verify, I actually, in writing my proposal, realized I think there's kind of a glitch in it when used in TypeScript, but that's a separate topic. The point is, though, it maximally constrains the way it is spent without constraining what is being spent. And so it exactly specifies the outputs that are going to be created, and it specifies the amounts of those outputs. It specifies how many inputs are going to go into the transaction. Really constrains things quite significantly on what's going to be created, but not what input goes into creating that.
Okay, yeah. So it gets a bit complicated, right? Because I think people might be used to things that already exist today. So, multi-sig, obviously, we've been talking about that exists today, and time-related things like check sequence verify or CLTV, that, but they relate to being able to spend an output, whereas in this case, we're talking about how you can, I guess, the idea is that we're going to use the proposal of CTV, and the idea of CTV is that you can use it for things like vaults without having to pre-compute hashes, as I understand, and that there might be other uses like non-interactive lightning channels, or maybe it is going to be used as part of coin pools and payment pools and things like this. Would you say that's a fair summary?
Yeah, because the CTV hash commits to what outputs will be created. And once you get an output on chain that commits to a CTV hash, if it's a plain CTV where there's no other kind of side spending hatches, the plain CTV is going to exactly guarantee that the only way some coin can be spent is to create a specific set of outputs. And so it's as good as being paid, right? So if someone, like, let's say an exchange, creates a CTV output that commits to paying me, and they can show that there's no other escape hatch in that, I can accept that I've been paid. Even though my output doesn't exist in the UTXO set, because it exists in a CTV, I have been paid. There's no other way for that coin to be spent. And that's really what a lot of the CTV use cases revolve around, that idea that a CTV virtually creates some UTXOs that can be then really created later when you need them, but they're not actually created when the CTV is created.
Right. And as I understand, that could be useful in context where maybe the fees are really high right now and the exchange needs to do a quick, like a lot of users want to withdraw all at once. And so long as those users have opted into a CTV context, they could sort of not receive the output right now, but be provably sure that they will get it. Is that a fair way to say it?
Yeah, that's one of the use cases. Jeremy Rubin called that the congestion control use case. But then there's also like the Barak's ARC proposal. I know you've talked to him as well. In there is an escape hatch, but it's a time delayed escape hatch. So the ARC pool creates a CTV output that commits to everyone's UTXOs, but 4 weeks later, the ARC pool can reclaim that. So during those 4 weeks, you've got a virtual output that you could escape on chain with. But the idea is that you stay in the ARC pool and you spend that by basically paying it back to the pool in the meantime. So there's different ways you can use these commitments to creating an output, whether they be kind of permanent, like in an exchange congestion control, or whether they be temporary, like in an ARC pool. But it's a very powerful ability to create a commitment to create an output.
Yeah. And I guess maybe some users at this point or listeners are anticipating this, or maybe the objection from their perspective is, wait, why do I want to even use all this at all? Like, I just want the exchange to just pay me out now. But I guess the way I'm understanding it is, well, that might be possible. The exchange could just pay you out now, but that might be a much higher fee. And in a high fee environment, when it's congested, if more people are willing to opt into a CTV environment, let's say, then this enables certain things. And in the case of ARC, it enables another whole layer 2 that could be useful for people. So is that how you're seeing it, or how do you see that?
Yeah, no, I agree. The general thought that I focus my Bitcoin work on is around how do we get more people to be able to effectively use Bitcoin? Whether it be on chain, through Lightning, through some future thing like ARC, and CTV, by allowing these kinds of commitments to UTXOs, is clearly going to let at least some more people use Bitcoin effectively than we can right now. Now, do we need that right now? Not really, because fees have been relatively low, even despite the ordinal spike. They never got as high as they did back in the day. So people have asked, well, why now? And I think it's, we have to build for the future. I've been in Bitcoin long enough now, as I mentioned earlier, to know that things take a long time to build. So if we're going to have these next round of call it scaling technologies available when we need them, we really have to be building them now. Okay,
gotcha. Okay, so that's CTV. Can you now give us your layman's explanation of what is APO, ANYPREVOUT?
Yeah. So comparing it, I think, is the best way. So now that we've talked about CTV a bit, let's compare APO. What APO enables is, unlike CTV, it does not deliberately try to maximally constrain the outputs, because APO is compatible with SIG-hash single, where it only commits to one of the outputs of a transaction. And now, in some cases, that's a very powerful ability. The other thing that APO does is it allows some constraints on the input side as well. There's two modes of APO. There's ANYPREVOUT and ANYPREVOUT ANYSCRIPT. In the ANYPREVOUT only mode, it still commits to the input script being spent. So the output script pub key that is being spent is still committed to, even though not the transaction being spent. And that can be useful in certain kinds of contracts that CTV couldn't satisfy, because CTV doesn't commit to the inputs at all. So where CTV can spend anything CTV can spend anything that to the outputs specified, potentially APO can only spend things that also have the correct input script.
Back to the show in a moment. Are you looking to learn to build with Bitcoin? If you're interested in the topics covered in this episode, I think you'll really be interested in some of the classes that are offered by Base 58. Base 58 is a Bitcoin protocol school. This is the place to get guidance in your Bitcoin developer education. Of course, you could do it hard mode on your own, but with Base 58, you get guided pathways. There are online classes as well as in-person intensive classes where you can learn in a guided pathway from Bitcoin and Lightning experts. So they have a Taproot intensive in-person class coming up soon. This will cover using Taproot, TapScript, Schnorr, Frost, and MuSig2. This in-person Taproot intensive class is coming up just prior to TabConf in Atlanta from the 4th to the 6th of September, and this class is on again in Austin, Texas, the 13th to the 15th of November. So if you are interested and you want to build your skills, or maybe you are a beginner and you want to get started with Bitcoin development, there's something for everybody here. Go to base58.info or see the link in description. When it comes to securing your coins, coinkite.com is the place to go to get the hardware gear that you need to secure your coins. The Cold Card Mark IV is an ultra-secure device, and it works at all ranges of Bitcoin levels. If you are a beginner, you can just buy this device and buy a USB-C cable to plug it into your computer and use it easily with wallets such as Spectre Desktop or Sparrow or Electrum or even Nunchuck. And if you're intermediate or advanced, you can use all kinds of advanced features, whether that is using a passphrase, whether that is using it in air-gapped mode, or whether you want to use multi-signature. The Cold Card is such a reliable device and it works in all kinds of configurations. And the way you set it up is basically you plug it in either to the wall or into your computer if you're a beginner, and you can write down and create a pre-pin and a post-pin. You'll have 2 anti-phishing code words, and you will also generate a wallet where you write down 12 or 24 words. And then you can move that information back and forth with the client, such as Sparrow or Spectre or something else, and use that to sign transactions. So go to coinkite.com and use code Livera for a discount on your cold cards. Back to the show. I see. And so my understanding there is that the way, Christian Decker and maybe AJ and whoever else was involved were thinking about trying to minimize the foot guns involved so that the wallet developers would, not shoot themselves in the foot. And so that it's kind of like you're only opting into this environment, and it's specifically, in the case of L2, or nowadays I think people are calling it LN symmetry. That was the reasoning, right?
Yeah, a lot of things went into the design of APO. And what you're talking about there is that they decided, from an abundance of caution, to use a new TapScript key version so that existing scripts that are already out there couldn't be signed using SIG-hash ANYPREVOUT. An important kind of point of clarification on this is that because the signer selects the SIG-hash mode when they sign for a transaction, that was kind of the foot gun they were worried about, is what if a wallet signer signed an existing script once using ANYPREVOUT? Well, now all outputs to that same script are spendable immediately because they've signed with ANYPREVOUT. So if you think about, you've got a wallet, you've got a bunch of addresses, and each address might have a bunch of UTXOs associated with it. If you sign one of those UTXOs with ANYPREVOUT, all of the UTXOs on the same address can be spent in the same way, because you don't specify which UTXO you're spending when you sign with ANYPREVOUT. And so that's why they chose to use a different key version in specifying ANYPREVOUT, because it prevents that specific foot gun of some existing script being signed that way.
Okay, gotcha. And so the main use people talk about with APO generally is this idea of LN symmetry. But as I understand from listening to some Christian Decker talks, I think he's mentioned that there are ways that you could sort of hack things around, and you could use APO for a lot of the similar things that people talk about for CTV. Maybe 1 or 2 use cases are not possible, but it's kind of a more hacky method, maybe a more costly on-chain method, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You can get a lot of the CTV behavior by using ANYPREVOUT, any script with SIG-hash all. That's a similar commitment to the CTV hash. The one thing it doesn't do that CTV does is it doesn't sufficiently constrain the way the transaction is spent to be able to predict transaction IDs at the next level. So some of the things that Jeremy Rubin wrote about when he was talking about CTV a couple of years ago were kind of trees of CTVs. And in some of those cases, you need to be able to predict transaction IDs based on what transaction ID is input. and APO doesn't constrain sufficiently to predict future transaction IDs. The other thing, as you said, there's a higher cost to using APO in that way because with CTV, you put a 32-byte hash on chain, and then you check it against the transaction that's spending it. If you want to use APO in this way, you have to put a pub key, 33 bytes, and a 65-byte signature all on chain to get the same result as just a 32-byte hash would have given you with CTV.
Okay, gotcha. And so then let's talk a little bit about, I understand you had, I guess, those were some of your critiques of APO. I think I saw on some of your online discussion, you were critiquing APO, and then you had like a modification, or I think you made a pull request to a particular part of APO, and then now you've come up with this proposal yourself. Do you want to just elaborate there for us?
Yeah. So that's some of my kind of issues, if you will, with APO. It's like it accidentally creates a covenant kind of like CTV, but because it's accidental, it's not very good. And I'd rather see, if we're going to have covenants created, that we do it in a deliberate and conscious way. So then I was like, I looked and I created my original pull request against the APO BIP, which allows it to be used and I think, I haven't verified this fully, but I think fully emulate CTV by separating out some of the flags involved. The ANYPREVOUT implies anyone can pay, if that means anything to the listeners. And my pull request makes it not imply anyone can pay. It lets you specify anyone can pay separately. And that lets it then more fully emulate CTV. It's still much more bytes on chain, but at least now it's a deliberate, conscious, we're doing ANYPREVOUT, which enables a type of covenants. Let's make sure that we're making those covenants useful and kind of go forward with that would be the idea there. And then kind of continuing to research this over the months, realizing that I think it might be better, as Russell O'Connor had posted previously to the mailing list, to do covenants using some form of TX hash and check signature from stack, which then can cover both use cases, ANYPREVOUT and check template verify. Okay.
So do you mind just spelling out for us, what's TX hash and what's check sig from stack?
Yeah. So TX hash is a very, very broad idea, and my proposal deliberately constrains it. But in general, TX hash would be a Bitcoin script opcode that hashes some portions of the transaction currently being validated and puts them on the stack for later use in a script. The general proposal that Russell O'Connor originally made had a bunch of flags where you'd be like, I want to hash the inputs, I want to hash this input, I want to hash this, I want to hash that, and you kind of pick with a bunch of flags which things you want to hash into the hash that goes onto the script stack, and then the later script components can validate that hash in whatever way they want. They can validate it with a signature, or they can validate it with a comparison, just a quality check. The proposal I made was TX hash is probably something we want to do in Bitcoin someday, but right now, we have concrete use cases for check template verify and ANYPREVOUT. So let's make a version of TX hash that only does the things we have concrete use cases for, and specify those in a kind of a compact sort of way so that we're not, for lack of a better word, wasting on-chain bytes in using this. So that's the TX hash side, a very constrained TX hash that's just the same hashes that would be used in ANYPREVOUT or CTV, but where you have one opcode that can create the hashes for either of those other proposals. And then checksig from stack is comparing it to the existing checksig operations in Bitcoin script. Checksig hashes the transaction based on the signature's specified hash mode and then verifies the signature against that hash. But that hash never appears in the script stack. It's just inside the checksig function. Checksig from stack takes the hash to check the signature against from the existing script stack or script arguments. And so now we can hopefully start to see where these two things come together. If you use optx hash to create a hash and it goes on the stack, and then you have opchecksig from stack that can read that hash and check a signature against it, you can put those two things together to check different hashes than you can using regular opchecksigs.
Okay. I think I'm following. I'm still kind of. You're obviously, this is above my level, but let me just ask another question based on what I've read. I've heard of a term known as transaction introspection. Is this related to that?
Yes. So transaction introspection, as is available on the Liquid network, is being able to take specific pieces of the transaction and put them onto the stack for use in a script. So one of the common ideas would be, I want to get the input amounts and put them on the stack so that I can do math on them and check how much is being spent. So you could do like a velocity or a spend amount policy where coins locked to this script can only be spent a maximum of 1 Bitcoin at a time, let's say, because you could introspect on the transaction and see how much is being spent as part of your script verification. TX hash is a much more limited version of that because it doesn't put the actual amounts or anything on chain. It only puts a hash of the contents of the transaction on chain. There have been concerns about kind of the execution speeds and the risks of certain types of recursion that could be written and stuff if we do full transaction introspection. And so that's why I think at this moment in Bitcoin's history, the approach is to constrain things using a very specific hash that goes on chain and not to do full introspection where you put the values out of the transaction on chain.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's sort of started to click a little bit for me. So I guess as you've explained, right, we've explained, what your view of CTV is, what your view of APO is, and now what you're trying to do with this approach, which I guess you can sort of say it's trying to, let's say, thread the needle to allow only what we want without opening other doors, let's say. And so the idea is this proposal is there to sort of show this is what threading the needle might look like. Is that sort of what you're getting at?
Yeah. It's a combination of threading the needle and maybe, it's hard in the Bitcoin space right now trying to coalition build. There's there's APO camp and there's CTV camp. And like I said, they don't really seem to fully understand each other. And so I'm really hoping that by putting together a single proposal that does both, again, with a table in it that shows exactly what data is hashed in each of the modes, that we can at least start talking about how these things are very similar and what specific items from each we want to get into a change to Bitcoin.
I see. And so in terms of what these things are being enabled, so as an example, the APO camp wants LN symmetry or other potential, upgrades with the Lightning Network. And so your proposal enables that. Yep.
And then the CTV camp wants op vault, and they want potentially ARC, and they want congestion control, and a bunch of other things that I don't fully understand. There's the guy who posts about the Enigma network, which is very hard to think about.
Oh, Poly. Yeah, because he's talking about like transaction cut through, and it's very complicated.
And I think some of his ideas are probably realizable in practice, but probably not all of them. And it's very hard to separate those two things out. But yeah, that's right. Because this proposal allows each of the things that CTV offers and each of the things that APO offers, we can get those both and do it in a way where we talked about those APO covenants that have to be large on chain with a 65-byte signature and the 33-byte key. With this proposal, those same exact covenants are possible. No additional covenants, the same ones, but they're only 33 bytes instead of 65 plus 33. And so that's like, if we're going to enable those things, let's not make it wasteful to do it. Let's do it in a way that is compact and efficient. And that's why I kind of am in favor of this method of doing APO and CTV.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I think it sort of cut out for a little bit there, so I didn't quite catch all of that, but you were talking about the the size of the transaction, and could you just spell out in your proposal and contrast that against, CTV and APO in terms of how large the transactions would be?
Yeah, so with plain APO, to do covenants, you have to have a 33-byte key and a 65-byte signature on chain. With my proposal, you can build those exact same APO covenants, but with just a 32-byte hash and an opcode on chain. And so that's kind of the efficiency. If we're going to allow these kinds of covenants, let's do it efficiently and nicely.
I see. And then your proposal as compared to just bare CTV, how does that stack up?
So this is the downside of my proposal, because my proposal uses op success style upgrade. Detail is not important. It only works in TapScript. Whereas the CTV proposal as written allows CTV in legacy, on-chain, in SegWit, and in TapScript. And the result is that for the use case of what's called bare CTV, where the locking script of the transaction is exactly equal to the hash it's going to be spent in and the one opcode, this is significantly larger. I think it's 17 VBytes or something. It's quite a bit larger on-chain than bare CTV. So that's probably the single biggest downside of my proposal relative to the others. As others have said on X and elsewhere, there's nothing against doing what I've written here and CTV itself. I'm really mostly trying to educate and to bring awareness to the similarities here. And maybe the right thing to do is actually to implement my proposal and CTV, or my proposal and APO, or APO and CTV. I don't know what the right path is here, but I think we should at least be able to be clear-minded in talking about it.
I see. Okay, yeah. Because that also seems to be, there are some people talking about the idea of just having, let's just have CTV and APO. Do you have any objections to that, or do you think that that would be unnecessarily costly or have some other downside?
I am totally fine with CTV and APO. I think that APO has been developed to be extremely specific to kind of the LN symmetry, L2, and point time-locked contract use cases. It's very focused on enabling those, as opposed to focused on being a general script upgrade. And that's probably partially deliberate, because there's been this concern over how general covenants might get and the risks of general covenants in Bitcoin. Personally, I would rather have something more general than APO and not constrain it to these specific use cases. So I'm not against APO being activated, though. I hope that we can be clear about the ways in which it's been constrained to satisfy certain objections.
I see. And there's one other area you mention in your gist on GitHub, which is upgrade hooks of your proposal. So can you spell out what are those upgrade hooks and what would that mean for us?
Yeah, so I made it very specific in my proposal, in which cases a script validation fails versus in which case something that's not expected causes it to immediately succeed. And this is how Bitcoin upgrades over time. This is how soft forks are possible, is that there are certain types of Bitcoin outputs that anyone can spend. They're not currently checked for validation. And that means that we can, in the future, restrict how those are spent and keep a compatible upgrade where old nodes will accept the new spends and new nodes will validate it against the new rules. That's how SegWit was done. It's how Taproot was done. It's how all of these upgrades happen.
Yeah.
And by being very conscious in the design of my proposal of where things instantly succeed, we can have new hash types. Right now it specifies CTV and APO hashes. You could have new hash types and they would be soft fork upgradable. We could have new key types, new signature types on the checksig from stack, and they would be upgradable, etc. So that's kind of the idea of consciously making sure there's good ways to soft fork future upgrades to both TX hash and checksig from stack.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. And as you mentioned, the idea is to have it so that the old nodes are still forward compatible, that they won't reject the transactions that hypothetically, let's say the Bitcoin network says, yes, let's do this proposal from Brandon, let's do TX hash plus CS checksig from stack, or this proposal version of it, then we sort of, most people will get what they want, basically. The APO camp will be happy because they get LN symmetry and PTLCs. The CTV guys will be happy because they can do, CTV use cases as well. And the existing nodes who don't even want to upgrade, they won't have to fork off the network. I guess that's kind of what you're getting at here, right?
Yeah, and then also when we want to add new ways of using TX hash, we can also soft fork those. I was in researching all of this, I kind of came across some areas in the way Taproot was soft fork where I wish Taproot had more ways to upgrade. One specific example of this is that the exact shape of the Taproot control block, if it's not matched, the transaction validation fails, as opposed to potentially succeeding in a way that would allow us to soft fork a different style of control block. I know there are good reasons for the exact way that it is. I was just in that specific case disappointed that it wasn't upgradable in that way. So when designing proposals, I will certainly be trying to ensure that soft fork upgrades are possible wherever it is safe to do so.
Okay, great. Well, I think those are probably some of the key points. I guess for listeners who are concerned about covenants generally, do you have any thoughts for them on that? As in, covenants, are they good? Are they bad? Like, what would be the big risks in your view? I
would say there's really no risk to CTV-style covenants, effectively. People are always concerned about, what if someone locks your Bitcoin in a way you don't want? But that problem already exists. Someone could lock it to a multi-sig you didn't choose. We always, when we are going to receive some Bitcoin, we specify the address. And so no one can trick us into receiving covenanted Bitcoin or multi-sigged Bitcoin. It's our address. We chose the address. So CTV has absolutely, I would say, no risk. Obviously, code bugs aside, right? There could be a bug that creates a risk, but in terms of the design idea of a non-recursive covenant like check template verify, with recursive covenants, which ANYPREVOUT does enable recursive covenants, they're extremely expensive and hard to use, but it does enable them. I would say there's a concern that I don't personally share, but that some people have expressed over the ability to create long-lived counters on-chain with recursive covenants. There's this proposal that Jeremy Rubin wrote up. I shouldn't say proposal, this idea, not even a proposal, called Spook Chains that uses APO counters to do something somewhat similar to the hash rate escrow in the drive chains proposals. Again, it's not practically usable and it doesn't concern me, but at least some people wonder about what might be enabled by these kinds of counter type executions of essentially very, very slow block by block looping using something like a recursive covenant from APO.
I see. Yeah. And okay. Yeah. Cause I think I had heard some people chatting a bit about that, but it didn't seem like a very realistic, concern for, at least from what I could understand. But okay. And so I guess where to from here? What are you hoping people do in terms of this proposal and the general discussion?
My honest hope is that people spend the time to understand the things they're objecting to before they object. And that applies to me too. When I first started objecting to APO, I hadn't really fully understood it. And huge shout out to Rusty Russell for helping me understand APO better so that I could have good objections to it instead of half-baked objections. So reflecting on my own experience, really hoping that people use what I've written to understand these things more fully and then to comment on them intelligently so that we can figure out where we are in terms of the IETF rough consensus idea of how we move forward with Bitcoin.
Great. Okay. And lastly, where can people find you online and find your work?
Yeah, I'm Rearden Code, Rearden Code on most platforms.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Brandon. I think it's been a very educational episode, so thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much.
If you're enjoying the show, make sure to leave a like and share it with your friends. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the Citadels.